Okay, good morning. Our first year on Haggadah Shel Pesach with Rabbi Soloveitchik's insights. Um, what we're going to do is really share, in particular, Rabbi Soloveitchik's thoughts on the Haggadah, and we'll see how we can really inculcate them into our very being on understanding what Pesach is all about. The Rav discussed many issues over the years on Pesach. That was one of his major themes that he talked at length about, but he never wrote a Perush on the Haggadah per se. Though there's a few Haggadahs that have been produced in his name, they're Talmidim, they're students or family members that have compiled what he had said throughout the years in different shiurim. The major sources that I will use for these shiurim are the following, not limited, but these are the major. There's a Hebrew one, Haggadah Shel Pesach Siach Hagrid. It's written by a grandson, Rabbi Yitzchak Lichtenstein, and it's an excellent work. It's more lumdish, it's more halachically focused, but it's a brilliant work, and I will use that. Haggadah Shel Pesach, an exalted evening, the one I have right here. This is produced by the OU. The editor is Rabbi Menachem Genak. Also an excellent Haggadah based on the Rav's different shiurim throughout the year. And then there are shiurim that the Rav gave on Pesach and on Haggadah, found in a volume called Festival of Freedom. There's a whole series of works that they compiled based on the Rav's manuscripts, and they've produced numerous volumes. One volume in that series is called Festival of Freedom, and it's shiurim that the Rav gave on Haggadah and on Pesach itself. Those are the major sources that I will use, but not limited. Okay. And this shiur, the one that we're going to have this morning, is entitled The Preliminary Issues of the Seder Night. Really, we're going to focus on just a few items that are the preliminary, the introductory components of Seder night. You have to understand two things about the Haggadah. Number one, there's a dynamic that rules throughout the Haggadah, and you can't miss it. It rules from moment one. It begins and it only ends at the very end of the Seder. The dynamic I'm referring to is the tension of opposites. It's the experience of the tension of opposites. There's a tug of war between opposites throughout the Haggadah. There's a tension, for example, between freedom and slavery, life and death, order versus chaos. It's constantly, this tension reigns supreme in the Haggadah. And if you pay close attention, you can really sense it throughout the Haggadah. And this opposites of tensions even can be sensed in the preliminary aspects that we're going to deal with today. Number one. Number two, Rav Hershel Schachter Shlitas loves saying that what is the purpose of Seder night? The purpose of Seder night is to discuss emunah, faith in God. Well, faith in God is never just a linear experience. It's not a straight line. We experience in life ups and downs. That's the tension. That's the tension of life. It's not always good. It's not always bad. And sometimes the good and bad get mixed up at the simultaneous moment. And that's life. We say in the Haggadah, we're obligated to feel that we're re-experiencing the Yetzias Mitzrayim experience. The Yetzias Mitzrayim experience wasn't a straight line. It had its ups and its downs. Anybody who studies the Chumash realizes that at the very beginning of Shemos, it has its ups and downs. And that's the tension of life. And emunah, that the Haggadah is instilling into us, is a very important element. Rav Schachter always says that his Seder is discussion of emunah, of faith in God. That's what he wants to focus on Seder night. Okay, with those introductory words, let's begin with the preliminary issues that one confronts as they sit down on Seder night at the Seder. The first thing one notices that I quote an oddity is they notice that somebody's wearing a kittel. Last time I saw a person wear a kittel was on Yom Kippur in Shul. I never do I sit down at a table wearing a kittel. It just doesn't really make sense. To be honest with you, I must be totally show my hands. I don't wear a kittel at Seder. I'm a grandson of a Slabotka Mosmach, my grandfather, who I carry his name for. He earned his smicha in Slabotka in Lithuania, right outside of Kovna, and they did not practice wearing a kittel at the Seder. They were opposed to it because clearly they didn't think it was an appropriate custom to do. Now, I must admit, my sons-in-law wear kittlach, at the Seder. I know my son-in-law, Daniel, I have to double check if David does, but I know my son-in-law, Daniel, wears a kittel. That was his custom. But our custom in our home is not to do so. But nevertheless, I would say it's a very prominent and well-practiced custom in many homes. But why? Why on Seder should I have the Baal HaSeder, at least the Baal HaSeder, if not all of the men at the Seder, wear a kittel when it's associated with once a year, Yom Kippur? Okay, the Chazan wears it on Rosh Hashanah as well. The rabbi wears it on Rosh Hashanah as well, but the Baal Tekiah, but it's worn on the Yomim Noraim. And it really is a beged, it is a garment of tachrichim. It shrouds. You dress a dead body in a kittel. You don't wear a kittel to a celebration of chayrus, of freedom, of happiness, of simcha, right? There's v'samachta b'chagecha. We're supposed to be happy on Pesach night. Why would you wear a garment of death, if you will, to the Seder? Actually, that's why Slabotka said they were opposed to it, because Slabotka's philosophy was unlike Novardok. Novardok was totally focusing on man's limited capacity, if you will. The yeshiva in Slabotka, and they both were Musar schools, were Musar yeshivot. They were run by great Musar teachers, but Slabotka had the difference that it talked about gadlus ha'adam, the greatness of man. And they would say that in Slabotka, the boys were dressed very nicely. They were dressed very like elegant, elite individuals. That's the Alter of Slabotka, who ran the Slabotka, the Musar end of the yeshiva, felt that you had to focus on a Ben Torah being a very important, dignified human being. So they were opposed to, you can see why they would be opposed to the custom of wearing a kittel on Seder night. But yet, it's worn. And Rabbi Soloveitchik quoted the Netziv, Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the Rosh Yeshiva in Slabotka, in Volozhin, who suggested that on Pesach night, when the Korban Pesach plays such a crucial, essential role, kittel makes sense, actually. One of the halachos associated with consuming the Korban Pesach, the Paschal lamb, is that it had to be eaten in a dignified fashion, as if you were coming to a king's table, which you are. You're coming to the Melech Malchei Hamlochim, the king of all kings. So when you come to a king's table, you have to be dressed the role as well. Well, how are you supposed to be dressed when you eat the Korban Pesach? To demonstrate that dignity, the halacha demands the human being come in a very specific clothing. And the Netziv says the Torah identifies for us exactly which clothing we should come in, if you will. It goes back to Chumash Bereshis, when Paro appoints Yosef as the viceroy. He not only hands him the ring, indicating now he's the viceroy, but it tells us how he dressed Yosef. Listen to the pasuk in Perek Mem Aleph, pasuk Mem Beis in Bereshis. Vayosar Paro et tabato me'al yado, and Paro removed his ring from his hand. Vayitin oso al yad Yosef, and he put it on Yosef's hand. Vayalbesh oso, and he then had him dressed bebigdei sheish. Vayosem revid hazahav al tzavaro. He had him dressed in garments of linen, and he placed a gold chain upon his neck. And so the Netziv says, there you have it. What is the most dignified clothing? It's linen. It's white linen, if you will. And what is a kittel? White linen. Big day sheish. That is, if that's so, that's the Nitziv says, that's why we have a kittel. It's the garment, unlike Slobodka says, yes, it's the shrouds, but it's the garment of Yosef, if you will, when he was appointed to be viceroy. It's the big day shesh, it's the linen, the white linen of dignity. The Rav, however, so that makes sense. Then, if that's the case, then who should wear the kittel at the table? Just the Baal HaSeder, the one who's running the Seder. And yet the Rav defended that not only the Baal HaSeder, but maybe, first of all, the Rav defended why only the Baal HaSeder should wear it and not others. Why maybe every man should wear the kittel at the table. But the accepted custom is the Baal HaSeder wears it. The one who's running the Seder wears it. And the Rav defended that. He argued it makes a lot of sense that a Baal HaSeder should be the one wearing it, and not every man has to wear it, because really, he said, which is important, the kittel, like everything else that we do at the Seder, is to stimulate questions. It's to get the kids excited. Well, how do you get the children excited? You do show and tell. That's a perfect way to produce a response in children and all adults as well. You do show and tell, and you wonder, what is this show and tell all about? So the Baal HaSeder wearing it will intrigue a child. He's never seen his father sit down to the Seder, to a meal on Yontif or on Shabbos wearing a kittel. So that certainly will immediately stimulate the questions. And the Rav would quote the Rambam in Hilchos Chametz and Matzah, Perek Zayin, Halacha Gimel, that says that the Rambam notes that we do many acts that are not even mentioned in the Torah, in the Talmud, not mentioned at all on Seder night. And people have different customs in different families, and they're all fine. Why? Because their sole purpose is to do what? To stimulate a conversation. Whatever you do to stimulate the conversation, that people will focus on what's happening at Seder night, is totally appropriate. So Rabbi Soloveitchik says the kittel does that. The kittel does that. It serves as the royal garment on the one hand. On the other hand, it stimulates the questioning, doesn't it? It acts like a show and tell. As on the simple level, the child would be curious to know, why am I wearing a kittel? You never wear a kittel any other time. So what would the father answer according to Rav Soloveitchik? It's a garment of dignity. It's a garment just like Yosef wore. And Yosef is a very important person to the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, right? The whole story begins with Yosef, really. But then on a more analytical level, the child would be cognizant of how the kittel appears to be totally inappropriate. The older the child gets, the older the people around the table say, hey, why are you wearing something that is associated with Yom Kippur or something that's associated with death? It doesn't seem appropriate. And therefore, you begin with the tension that I alluded to. The tension at the Seder. On the one hand, the kittel represents dignity. On the other hand, the kittel represents the end of life, the tension, right? Life, death. Yes.
At the end of life, I mean, aren't you basically also going to have a meeting with the kids?
Yeah, exactly. That's why we dress. That is one of the explanations. Why do we dress a person in tachrichin? One of the reasons is exactly what you just said, Linda. That at the end of life, we are going to encounter the Melech Malchei Hamlachim, and we're dressed for the occasion. That is correct, if you will. Yes, that is okay. That is, I mean, the real reason that tachrichim were chosen, the Gemara tells us, was because they used to dress the dead in nice clothing. And the poor people didn't have the clothing to give their dead. And they would leave, the Gemara says, their dead out on the streets. They wouldn't bury them because they were embarrassed. They had nothing to bury them with. So then I think it was Rabbi Gamliel, the Gemara says, who says I think it's Rabbi Gamliel, the Gemara tells us who it was. He says that's no longer going to be the case. Everybody's going to be buried in the same clothing. We're all going to be equal, and it's going to be tachrichim. But the tachrichim are used for that very purpose, that they are royal, they are dignified. Okay, So that's number one. That's preliminary number one. What's the second thing that anybody coming to a Seder would note? They would note the Seder plate. We don't have a Seder. We don't have a plate on Rosh Hashanah. Oh, yeah, we have fruit, but some people put it out, some people don't. But every Seder has a Seder plate. You can't run a meal on Pesach night and the Seder without a Seder plate. And the Rav notes that on the Seder plate, there are two items that pique his interest, if you will. Rav Soloveitchik, again, focusing on tension. What are the two items on the Seder plate that seem to be opposites, that seem to be tension? It's the one, it's called the shank bone. The other, the egg. They're opposites. They're opposites. The shank bone and the egg. Why? These two items are mentioned in the Gemara in Pesachim, Kuf Yud Daled on the base 114b. It discusses the requirement. The Gemara says that on the Seder plate we should place shnei tafshilin, two cooked items. That's what the Gemara says. You have to place on the Seder plate two cooked items. Why two cooked items? Because there were two korbanot on Pesach. There was the korban Pesach, the Paschal lamb. There was also the korban Chagiga, the festival korban that was brought not only on Pesach, but was brought on Shavuos and was brought on Sukkot as well. Everybody that went Ola L'Regel, the pilgrimage, also brought a korban Chagiga with them for the Yamim Tovim. So the Gemara says you have to do Shnei Tavshilin. So the Gemara says you have to have two items that are cooked on the Seder plate. One to allude to the Korban Pesach, one to allude to the Korban Chagiga. And the Gemara then says that there's a machlokas between Rav Huna and Rav Yosef. What should these two items be? Rav Huna said they can be as simple as beets and rice. Well, you see, he's in Sephardi, right? Beets and rice. He says they're cooked. They're cooked items. In other words, it could be any items, any cooked items. But that's Rav Huna. Rav Yosef disagrees, and Rav Yosef says, no, they can't be just two. There have to be two that allude to the korbanot. So he says they should be meat. They should actually be different types of meat that should be on the korban, on the Seder plate. And the Rambam in Hilchos Halachos Chametz U'Matzah, Perek Ches Halacha Aleph, endorses the opinion of Rav Yosef that it has to be items that really would remind us of the korban. And so what should they be? So they're told one should be the shank bone, right? One should be that, and the other should be the egg. What's the egg representing a korban for, a korban chagiga? In other words, shank bone will be korban Pesach. The korban chagiga will be the egg. And why the egg? So the Shulchan Aruch Chaim, tells us in Tov Chof Ches Seif Gimel, excuse me, it notes that something odd happens in the calendar, and that is the day that Pesach falls on, the first day of Pesach will be the same day of the week that Tisha B'Av falls on. Tisha B'Av and Pesach always are the same day of the week. So if you want to know this year when Tisha B'Av, what day of the week Tisha B'Av will be, it's going to be Monday night and Tuesday. You can check in your calendars. It does not fail. The first night of Pesach defines the same day of the week of Tisha B'Av, reminding us that, there's a connection between Pesach and Tisha B'Av, meaning that as we celebrate the Seder, we remind ourselves, again, tension, isn't it? Celebration, destruction. The Korban Pesach, and yet we have an egg, which is usually what's an egg used for? An ovel, because that is the Sudas Havrah. That is the food that we bring to the ovel when the ovel begins their shiva. They eat the egg. The egg is usually the meal of condolence after the funeral. If this is so, the egg has two opposite messages, doesn't it? On the one hand, it is a symbol of joy. reminding us of the Korban Chagiga. On the other hand, it's again the tension that I talked about. What's the tension? It's reminding us of the mourning associated with Tisha B'Av. But what's the connection between these two opposites emotionally at the Seder night? So Rav Soloveitchik would quote his grandfather, the Beis Halevi, who noted that many of the Midrashim point out this fact. How many years did the Torah tell us that we were going to be slaves in Mitzrayim? For 400. How many years did we end being Mitzrayim? 210, right? 210. We were supposed to be enslaved 400 years. The Beis Halevi, the great-grandfather of Rav Soloveitchik, he would quote his great-grandfather, his namesake, and say, 1 second, we were supposed to be there for 400 years. We only were there for 210. Why? The reason offered, why was it cut short? Because we were in danger of completely losing our Jewish identity, the Medrash says. If we would have remained in Egypt, we would have been totally assimilated. That's what the Medrash says. So we were prematurely redeemed. But that means that what do you have in the hopper? You have a few years that are balanced, that have to be paid up, if you will. And therefore, to experience those days, you had other exiles to make up the time, if you will. In other words, the redemption from Egypt, according to the Beis Halevi, was not a complete redemption. The egg, therefore, alludes to the fact that this night, we remember that fact in history as well. Again, another tension, isn't it? It's the tension between celebration and confronting destruction, confronting avelut. The Rav therefore noticed, by the way, that it's not coincidental that when the Talmud talks about Tisha B'Av, it uses the same expression as it talked about Pesach. We said that the Gemara said, how many items do we have to have? Cooked items? Shnei tafshilin, 2 cooked items on the Seder plate. When it comes to halachos for Tisha B'Av, there's a meal right before we start Tisha B'Av, right? The Seudah right before we start Tisha B'Av. And the Gemara, so the Mishnah says, how many items may you eat? Only 1. Shnei tafshilin are not allowed to be eaten before the fast. The same words, shnei tafshilin. Shnei tafshilin, the Rav notes, is used by Pesach, and shnei tafshilin again appears by Tisha B'Av in the opposite direction, right? Shnei tafshilin is required by Pesach. Shnei tafshilin becomes forbidden by Tisha B'Av. Oh, what is this terminology teaching us? Rabbi Soloveitchik said, it's not coincidental. It's our sages telling us that both cases, the Pesach and Tisha B'Av, are correlated. It's between these 2 days, there's a correlation. This is the tension of life. And the Seder night reminds us of this tension of life. In her wonderful Haggadah, Erica Brown sums up the Seder plate as follows, and I quote her. The plate is not only a container of the symbolic foods of the evening, it is also a platform for the experience of the Jew at Seder. The placement of the foods on the Seder signifies the way we are supposed to feel and takes us through the Exodus experience. It's a journey. Seder night is a journey. The Seder plate is not just foods, she's noting. It's, if you will, the platform of the emotional experience of the Jew. It goes as follows. It creates a bittersweet theme of the evening. We move between foods with a positive association and those with a negative association. Again, tension, 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 often combining them to achieve food contradictions. Those are her words. A food contradiction. For example, our egg can symbolize the circle of life and fertility. The fertility, where was fertility? The Jews, according to the Haggadah, had tremendous fertility. They were blessed with many children, 6 at a time, right? Isn't that what the Haggadah says? I can't imagine that, but right. But the fertility in Egypt, and at the same time, the egg represents the pain, the loss of life, since the eggs are eaten as the mourner's meal. In other words, a food of food on the Seder plate is representing this enormous tension of life. The egg itself, in itself, is giving, excuse me to say, is giving birth to two ideas. One, fertility, the other, the end of life, all in the same. Our shank bone from the ancient Paschal lamb is the most compelling symbol of our redemption on the plate. But it sits, she notes, in a circle with bitter herbs, representing the weight of our persecution. She's also noting this very point that Rabbi Soloveitchik kept on noting, the need of, throughout the Haggadah, to confront the tensions. The circular shape of the plate itself keeps these emotions spiraling through us, encircling us with the constant change of meaning. We take karpas, often associated with the verdant green of spring, and dip it in salt water. Salt water is emblematic of our tears. Later, we will put horseradish and charosas together on the matzah to achieve the same emotional push and pull that the eating is designed to create, right? All this tension. In so doing, we take a page from Erica Brown notes from Walt Whitman's playbook. And she quotes Whitman. He says, "Do I contradict myself? Very well. Then I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes." That's a brilliant quote. Do I contradict myself? Very well. Then I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. The Seder night is the Jew through history. How is it the Jew experiences contradictions, sometimes at the same moment? We Jews understand that better than anyone, and we right now understand that. We just had Purim, and the whole discussion before Purim was, how are we going to celebrate Purim this year in light of the war? In Eretz Yisrael, there was a question, and in America, in the world, was a question. How does a Jew celebrate Purim at the same time as he's at war? The tensions, right? The tensions of life. How are we going to celebrate Pesach? The Pesach, the night of redemption. You know what we're going to celebrate, and we should discuss at our tables with our families, is this pull, this tension, this emotional contradictions that are so much a part of the Seder, because life is not a straight line. Life is ups and downs, ups and downs. I remember Rabbi Soloveitchik would do this when he would talk about Jewish history. He would take his finger and he would go, I will show you what Jewish history is. Jewish history is up, down, up, down, up, down. He says, that's Jewish history. He turned to us. I remember he was taking his finger up and down, up and down, up and down. That's Jewish history. And you know what Goyish history is? The world's history is nations go up, down, disappear. It's over. They go up, they climb up, they ascend, and then they disappear. They never rebound, never rebound. Show me one of the ancient people that are still here. None of them. They never rebound. The Jew constantly rebounds. He's up and down, up and down. You know that that's the reason we do Kiddush Levana. Kiddush Levana every month reminds us that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to make sure that Klal Yisrael never disappears. It always comes back just like the moon. Okay, number two. Number three on the preliminaries. What next comes along? This is all just really the introduction to the Seder and how Rav Soloveitchik is noting these important things. Then the next thing that you do at a Seder is something unusual, and anybody is being astute says, hey, this is different, and that is Simonei HaSeder. Kadesh, Shurchatz, Karpas, Yachatz, Magi, Rosa, Motzi Matzah, right? And we sing it not only. We have a Seder, Simonei HaSeder, to the to-do list. We have a checkoff list. We have a checkoff list? What do you mean? As we begin the sukkahs, we sit down in our sukkah, do we go, okay, this is what we got to do. Leishe Basukkah and this and that. No, it's not done. Only one night a year do we have a checkoff list, a to-do list, and we begin the Seder by singing Simonei HaSeder, the taxonomy of ritual, it's called in fantastic language, right? Taxonomy of ritual, that means the list that will occupy us for the night. Order anybody who understands halacha is not shocked by order. Order is the way you study halacha. Halacha's order is crucial to halacha. When we do everything, and I remember Rabbi Soloveitchik telling us in Shir, 1 minute before Shkia is still not Shabbos. 1 minute after Shkia, you better not light a candle. You're Mechalel Shabbos. 1 minute before Tzeis HaKochavim is still Shabbos. 1 minute after Tzeis HaKochavim on Saturday night, okay, it's now the weekday. A minute, a second. We are, I wonder what a non-from or certainly a non-Jew would look at our Shabbos bulletin times and go, what in the world is this? 6:17. What's 6:17? What's 6? Yeah, I'm just giving you a random number, right? What's 6:17? Shabbos starts at 6:17. What time's halakas ner? 5:58. 5:58. What's 5:58? Right? And why don't you just round it off to 6 o'clock or 5:30 or 5:45? Give me a normal time. Jews are not normal. Jews are punctilious in exactness. The Rav would call it the science of halacha. The science of halacha requires the devil, the devil is in the details. That is a Jewish concept. That's right. The devil's in the details. And we understand order is crucial. When we perform mitzvos, you better be careful with the order. You better be careful with the time. And if one goes off and doesn't perform exactly in the order that he's supposed to, will he be mekayim? Will he fulfill the mitzvah? Most probably not. Quite often the order is so crucial that if you don't follow the order, sorry, you didn't fulfill the mitzvah, correct? Or, for example, sometimes not only won't you fulfill the mitzvah, it'll cause damage in the long run. So it's worth noting the Rav teaches that the Rambam uses the same wording for Seder night as he does when he talks about Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur, is order crucial? Of course it is. The Kohen Gadol had to perform a ritual in the Beis Hamikdash by an order. And the Rav says it's not coincidental that when the Rambam talks about Seder night and he talks about the Avodas Yom HaKippurim, he uses the same language. For example, when the Rambam talks about Seder night in Hilchos Chometz U'Matzah, Perek Ches, Halacha Aleph, listen to his words. Sidur Asiyas Mitzvos, Elu Belel Chamisha Asar Kachu. The order of the actions, Sidur Asiyas HaMitzvos, the order of the way we perform the mitzvos on Seder night is as follows. That's in his discussion of Seder. Now listen to Avodas Yom HaKippurim. Seder, Kol HaMasim Shebayom Zeh Kachu. The order for the avoda of Yom HaKippurim, so it is. This is the way it is. He uses the same language, Seder, Seder, Seder. Both of them, and it's not unusual. The Rav, by the way, has discussed that his two most impressive nights in his life that formed his Weltanschauung, those were his words, his Weltanschauung, his world outlook were 2 nights of the year, which were Seder night and Yom Kippur night. He says, I stood with my grandfather Reb Chaim on both of those nights, and I gained an appreciation of what Judaism is all about. Those were the exalted nights of the Jewish calendar, Seder night and Yom Kippur night. And by the way, they have a connection as well. On Seder, how do we end? L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim. How do we end Yom Kippur? L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim. Correct? It's very important connection. So the Rav explains it's not non-intentional. It's intentional. The Rambam was teaching us that order is essential on these 2 most important nights of the year. For example, the Gemara asks the following question in Pesachim, Kuf Yud Daled Amud Beis, Kuf Tesvav Amud Aleph. It discusses what happens if you only have 1 vegetable at your Seder. And the vegetable is the vegetable that you're going to use for maror. But you use a vegetable also before you eat maror. Where do you use a vegetable? For karpas.
So you only have one vegetable. Now you have that, the Gemara wants to know, you have that vegetable and you only have one. So you're going to use it for karpas. Why is that a problem? Because you're going to eat the vegetable that you want for moror before you eat matzah. But moror is supposed to come after you eat matzah because the Torah gave us an order. Al matzos umororurim yochluhu. Right? You eat matzos and then moror. And the Gemara is asking a very important question. If you only have that one vegetable and you eat it as karpas, what have you done? Your order has become chaos. You're not following order. This is all crucial because we can't have order out, not at the Seder. Order is very important. And for example, why is it so important? What does Chazal tell us? We're supposed to eat our matzos, but what is the Torah call matzah? Lechem. What does that mean? The Gemara says, lechem only means the bread of affliction. But that's not the way the Gemara explains lechem oni. The Gemara says, lechem she'onin alav devarim harbe. Matzah is the food that we speak a lot about. In other words, matzos are supposed to be used for what? To stimulate conversation. It's all the show and tell of the Seder night. Matzos is a lechem she'onim alav devarim harbe. Therefore, if one was to consume matzah, the Gemara wants to know, if I consume matzah before I say magid, have I fulfilled the mitzvah of matzah? Well, have I? Have I fulfilled the mitzvah of magid? Well, have I? The answer is not really. Why? Because the matzos and the story are supposed to go together. There's supposed to be an order. There's a Seder, and that's why you have the Simonim HaSeder. You have the taxonomy of the rituals of the Pesach night. You list them because Seder is so important to halacha. They're supposed to go hand in hand. And yet, Erica Brown illuminates this point by the following comment. Human beings have a supreme need for order, she writes. It is the commitment to discipline that allows the randomness of events to have meaning. Listen to that again. It's the commitment to discipline that allows the randomness of events to have meaning. Things must be shaped and named, placed and organized. If Seder means order, then we begin as we intend to continue, emphasizing the imposition of order as our very first order of business. We have to worry about order. Chaos doesn't allow us to give meaning to life. But then something happens, she notes, and that is order doesn't remain order at the Seder. Again, the tension that I talked about. We tell a story. Stories are not orderly. They're not linear. We start with questions. Well, as soon as you open yourself to questions, you don't have definitive answers, do you? You have start questions. Well, questions are messier than answers, right? We acknowledge that there are different types of children at our table, don't we? We talk about 4 different types of children who must all hear the story and who all have different abilities to absorb and to speak and to tell. And you have to guide the conversation according to each one. Is that going to be an orderly conversation? Nope. Nope. You started with order, but boy, did you shift quickly, correct? Our story begins with a baseless hatred, originating long before the Exodus, an illogical and unjust sentiment that drives the narrative. Even in a world so neatly crafted, we find out that not all is under our control. On the one hand, we want order to give life meaning. On the other hand, life itself is chaotic. It is not under our control. Now I'll end where I started. Rabbi Herschel Schachter says, what is the purpose? What's the real goal of Seder night? To discuss emunah. Emunah, faith in God. We are not in control. Somebody else is in control. Yes, we bring the message of order to our lives, and we try to bring that, into our lives. And that's why we start the Seder with order, but we know darn well that order is not going to remain because life doesn't have an orderly progression. Life is like the story of the Haggadah. It goes all over the place, doesn't it? It's here, there, and everywhere. That is what the Seder night's all about. So to end where we began, we did this morning just the preliminary issues of the Haggadah and how the Rav understands these preliminary issues. And we saw the kittel, how the kittel is a garment of royalty on the one hand. On the other hand, it's a garment of death. It's the tension. And we discussed why would that be, right? And it takes us all the way back to Yosef. Then we talked about the Seder plate. The Seder plate, the items that piqued the Rav's interest was, on the one hand, you have the item, the shank bone, which reminds us of the Korban Pesach. On the other, you have the egg, which reminds us of the Korban Chagiga. But it's much more than that, isn't it? It reminds us of, on the one hand, the celebration of freedom. On the other hand, the Churban, right? The mourning that Tisha B'Av and Pesach join together. Again, the tensions and how we resolve these tensions. They come together to a point where they are simultaneous. And then we talked about the Seder, the Simoni HaSeder, the to-do list. This is the only holiday that we have a to-do list. And we talked about the fact that that also is a tension. On the one hand, we want order. On the other hand, we're telling a story. And a story, by definition, is going to be chaotic. Okay, so this is just the opening. We'll continue through the Haggadah for the next few weeks. We will see more and more insights by Rabbi Soloveitchik. But in particular today, it was the point of the tension that exists at the Seder. Focus on that. That is a worthwhile discussion, in particular this year. Okay?
Okay. Rabbi, thank you very much. Have a good day.
You're welcome. Everybody have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Sitting there with the child, and you want to summarize it, let's say in 20 minutes. You want to get to the most important parts of the Seder. Right. They don't have an attention span. But if you're